The plate was already there when Etta Merritt walked back into the dining room. She had not agreed to anything. She had not said yes to a single word of what Micah Hale had proposed that afternoon, standing on the porch of his sprawling ranch house with his hat in his hands and the late September sun turning everything the color of hammered copper. She had told him she needed to think. She had told him she was not the kind of woman who made decisions without weighing them, without turning them over and over in her palms like a river stone, until she understood what was underneath. She had said those exact words, and he had nodded, and she had gone to sit by the creek that ran behind the property, listening to the water argue with the rocks while she argued with herself. And now she was back in the house, and there were 4 plates on that long pine table, and only 3 of them made any sense at all. The boys were already seated. Caleb, who was 11 and wore his feelings on his face like a broadside posted on a saloon wall, was watching her with enormous, hopeful eyes. Thomas, who was 9 and far too clever for his own good, had folded his hands in front of him with an expression of studied innocence that would not have fooled anyone who had ever met a 9-year-old boy. The plate set for her was between them and across from where Micah always sat, as if it had been there forever, as if this was simply where Etta Merritt belonged, as if the question she had gone to the creek to consider was already answered by a dinner plate and 2 children who were too desperate to pretend otherwise. Micah walked in from the kitchen carrying a cast-iron pot. He set it on the trivet in the center of the table. He looked at the plate she was staring at. He looked at his sons. He pulled out his own chair and sat down without saying a single word about any of it. That silence was the most dangerous thing Etta had encountered in the entire state of Texas. She stood in the doorway with the last of the evening light at her back and the smell of beef stew filling every corner of the room, and she understood with terrifying clarity that she was in a trap she had not seen coming. Not a cruel trap, not a malicious one. The most disarming kind of trap there was. The kind built entirely out of hope. It had started 3 weeks earlier in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, which sat at the very edge of the cattle frontier like a man leaning too far over a precipice and refusing to step back. It was September of 1882, and Etta had arrived on the Santa Fe line with $40, a carpetbag containing everything she owned, and a job offer from a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Crane, who ran the town's only proper boarding house, and had advertised in the St. Louis newspaper for a respectable woman of sound character and basic literacy to help manage the premises. The advertisement had not mentioned that Mrs. Crane would be dead of a stroke on the very morning of Etta's arrival, or that her nephew, a disagreeable man named Gerald Crane, would be there to inform Etta that the position no longer existed and that she was, in his professional and thoroughly unsympathetic opinion, entirely his problem. She was not his problem. She told him so. She took her carpetbag and walked out into the main street of Caldwell in the September heat, with the sun pushing down on her like a firm hand and the dust of the cattle trail already coating her boots, and she made a quick and ruthless inventory of her situation. She was 27 years old. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a printer who had died when she was 16, and left her nothing except a love of books and an absolute unwillingness to be defeated. She had spent the following 11 years working in other people's houses, other people's shops, and for the past 4 years, teaching at a small school in the city. The school had closed when the church that funded it lost its patronage, and that was when the advertisement in the paper had seemed like fate. Fate, she was beginning to suspect, had a very mean sense of humor. She walked the length of Caldwell's Main Street and made note of what was available. A general store owned by a man named Abernathy who already had a wife and 2 daughters running the counter. A saloon that employed women but not the way Etta intended to be employed. A lawyer's office, a telegraph office, a barber, a livery stable, a doctor who had hung out a fresh shingle but whose office was still largely empty, and at the far end of the street, a notice board covered with the usual layering of circulars and wanted posters and community announcements. One notice was newer than the others. The ink was not yet fully faded. It read, "Housekeeper needed at the Hale Ranch, 7 miles north on the Chisholm Road. 2 boys, ages 9 and 11. Wages fair. Inquire at the Abernathy store or ride out direct. No time wasters." Etta had read it twice and made her decision in approximately 30 seconds. She went to the Abernathy store and inquired. Mrs. Abernathy, a large and forthright woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, looked Etta over with the frank assessment of someone who had been sizing up strangers for a long time and was rarely wrong about them. "You know about Micah Hale?" Mrs. Abernathy asked. "I know he needs a housekeeper," Etta said. "He's a widower. Wife died 2 years back. Fever. He's a good man, Micah Hale, but he's got walls built around him like a military fort, and he doesn't let people pass them easily. Those boys are sweet children who are grieving and lonely and need a steadying hand." She paused. "He's had 2 women out there already. One lasted 4 days, one lasted just under 2 weeks. He's not unkind, mind you. He just doesn't make it easy." "I'm not easily discouraged," Etta said. Mrs. Abernathy studied her for another long moment and then wrote down directions on a scrap of paper and handed it over. "You can borrow the Hendersons' wagon if you leave it with old Pete at the livery when you get back to town. Tell Micah Hale that Ruth Abernathy sent you and that she expects him to behave himself." The Hale Ranch was 7 miles of rolling grassland with the first hints of autumn turning the tips of the bluestem gold. The ranch house was substantial, built from limestone and timber, with a wide covered porch and a view that went on forever in 3 directions. The barns were well maintained. The fences were straight. Everything about the place spoke of a man who worked hard and took pride in what he had built, and the loneliness sat over it all like a second sky. Micah Hale had been splitting wood in the yard when the wagon came up the road. He had not moved from the task immediately, which Etta later understood was not rudeness but the particular caution of a man who had been disappointed enough times to stop running toward things. He set down his axe and walked to the fence and looked at her, and the first thing she noticed about him was that he was not what she had expected. She had expected a man hardened entirely by the frontier, all angles and silence and weather-beaten severity. He was those things partly. He was tall and lean with dark hair that had some early gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved for the express purpose of setting firmly. His eyes were a shade of gray-green that she had not previously seen in a human face, the color of sage after rain, and they were watchful in a way that went beyond mere caution into something more like sustained grief. He was also, unexpectedly, reading a letter when she pulled up, and he folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket before he came to the fence. A man who received letters and treated them carefully. She filed that away. "You're here about the position," he said. It was not a question. "Etta Merritt," she said. "Mrs. Abernathy sent me. She said to tell you she expects you to behave yourself." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. The place where a smile had once lived. "She would say that," he said. He looked at the wagon and then back at her. "You got experience, running households, teaching children. I was a school teacher in St. Louis for 4 years before my school closed. Before that, I worked as a housekeeper for a family on Lindell Boulevard. Before that, I managed the accounts for my father's print shop." She looked at him steadily. "I'm capable. I'm not given to dramatics. I don't scare easily, and I have no place else to go, which means I won't leave at the first sign of difficulty." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him she could see 2 boys appearing at the edge of the barn door like small cautious animals, watching. "The boys," he said, "they've been through a hard time. Mrs. Abernathy told me. I'm sorry for your loss." "Don't," he said, and it was sharp enough that she felt it. "Don't sorry me. I get enough of that in town." He looked at her again and then looked away out over the grass. "I'll pay you $12 a month. You'll have the room at the back of the house. It's got its own window, meals included. Your business is cooking, cleaning, mending, and seeing to it that the boys do their schoolwork. Anything else is not your concern, and I'll thank you to remember that." "Understood," she said. "I'm not looking for conversation," he said. "I'm not looking for company. I'm looking for someone to hold this household together while I work the ranch." "Also understood," Etta said. "I'll stay out of your way." He looked at her once more with those storm-colored eyes and then opened the fence gate and held it for her with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised right, even if he had partially forgotten it. "Come on, then," he said. "I'll show you the house." She had expected the house to be in poor condition. It was not. It was clean but austere, the way a space becomes when grief has drained all the color and warmth out of it and left behind only function. The curtains were plain muslin. The shelves held necessary things only. There were no flowers, no decoration, no softness anywhere except in a faded quilt on the back of a chair that she later learned had been made by the boy's mother. His name had been Margaret. Etta learned it not from Micah, who never spoke of her, but from Caleb, who told her on the third morning while she was making breakfast, and he was watching her from the kitchen doorway with those transparent eyes. "Our mother used to make Johnny cakes on Fridays," Caleb said. "Her name was Margaret. She had red hair." "That's a beautiful name," Etta said carefully. "Papa doesn't talk about her," Caleb said. "Thomas cried every night for 6 months after she died, but he doesn't anymore. I still do sometimes, but only when Papa can't hear." Etta had turned from the stove then because she could not stand to cook while a child said something that's serious to her. She crouched down to Caleb's level and looked at him directly. "It's all right to cry when you miss someone," she said. "It doesn't mean you aren't brave. It means you loved someone, and that's the most important thing a person can do." Caleb looked at her with that devastating openness and said, "Are you going to stay? The last lady didn't stay." "I'm planning on it," Etta said, though she had only been there 2 days and had not yet decided anything of the kind for certain. He nodded seriously and went to get the butter from the larder, and she stood up and faced the stove again and pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes for just a moment before she got back to work. Thomas was the harder one. He was clever in the way of children who have discovered that intelligence can be used as a defensive weapon, and he watched Etta with a detached assessment that was frankly unnerving in a 9-year-old. He tested her. He moved things to see if she would notice. He answered her questions with other questions. He brought her a horned lizard on the 4th day and put it on the kitchen table during breakfast, and she picked it up calmly and set it in a jar and told him it would be happier outside, and the look of grudging recalibration that crossed his face was the first real opening she got with him. Micah was exactly as advertised. He rose before dawn. He worked the ranch from sunup to sundown with 2 hired hands named Dietz and Rufus, who were steady, laconic men of around 40 who ate in the bunkhouse and minded their own affairs. Micah came in for meals, ate in near silence, asked the boys brief and genuine questions about their day, and then spent the evenings in his study or on the porch. And the distance he maintained was so deliberate and so complete that it felt less like personality and more like a decision he had made and was committed to the way a man commits to breaking a difficult horse. He was also, when he did not know he was being observed, something else entirely. She saw it first on the 5th day, when she was coming back from the well and heard him in the barn talking to Caleb. Caleb had been upset about something at school, something another boy had said, and Micah was in there in the dim light with his hand on the back of his son's head, and his voice was nothing like the flat, controlled thing she had heard at the dinner table. It was low and warm and full of something that had no armor on it at all, and she stopped walking because she felt suddenly that she was looking at something private, the true interior of a man who had walled himself off from the world but not from his children, and the contrast hit her somewhere in the chest with enough force that she had to stand still for a moment before she could move again. She told herself it was not her business. She kept telling herself that for 2 more weeks. The trouble was, it became harder to believe the more she saw. There was the morning she found him on the porch before sunrise with a book of poetry she had not known was in the house, and when she brought him coffee without being asked, he looked up at her with the particular startled expression of someone who had forgotten that other people existed, And then he said thank you in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice. And she took her own coffee and went back inside before either of them could say anything that would complicate things. There was the evening Thomas asked her to read to them, and she read from a copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that Caleb had gotten from the town library, and she became so engaged in the story that she did voices and gestures without thinking about it. And when she finally looked up, both boys were thoroughly entranced, and Micah was standing in the doorway of the study with his shoulder against the frame, and an expression on his face she could not entirely read, something between startled and hungry. And he caught her noticing him and went back to his desk without comment. There was the day she went to town for supplies, and Mrs. Abernathy asked her how she was getting on, and Etta found herself defending Micah Hale with more heat than the situation required when Mrs. Abernathy said something gently pitying about his withdrawn nature. And she did not realize she had done it until she was halfway back to the ranch and sat with the realization that she had, at some point in the past 10 days, started to care what people thought about this man. There was the afternoon she misread the measurements for a fence repair and had to go out to the north pasture to tell Dietz the correct numbers, and she got caught in a sudden rain on the way back, one of those fast, violent September storms that blow in off the Kansas plain without warning, and she was thoroughly soaked by the time she got back to the yard, and Micah was there, because he had seen the storm coming and had come to find her. And the look on his face when he saw her walking through the gate was not the look of a man who regarded her as hired help. He said nothing. He took his coat off and put it around her shoulders and walked beside her to the house, and he did not touch her except for that coat, and he did not say a word except to tell her she should change before she caught cold. And she went to her room and stood in the middle of it, dripping on the floorboards, and understood with the cold clarity of someone who knows they are in trouble that the distance she had maintained for 2 weeks was becoming very difficult to maintain. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was proximity and loneliness and the particular intimacy of shared domestic life. She told herself all the sensible things. She was telling herself those things when, on the 15th day, Thomas said to her at the dinner table with his 9-year-old eyes looking at her with total seriousness, "Do you think you could teach us the way you taught at your school? Not just the regular homework things, but the other things, the interesting things." And Micah had looked up from his plate. "What interesting things?" Etta asked. "The things from the Jules Verne book," Thomas said. "The things about how the world works. Caleb wants to know about stars. I want to know about machines. And boats, if you know about boats, even though we don't have any." Etta had looked at Micah to make sure she was not overstepping, and he had looked at her across the table with those complicated gray-green eyes and said, "Whatever you think is useful," which was, from him, a permission of considerable weight. After that she had started teaching them properly, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with whatever books and materials she could find or send away from the town library. She taught Caleb the names of the stars and how navigators used them, using charts she drew herself on paper. She taught Thomas basic mechanics using the parts from a broken clock Micah had sitting in the barn. She read them history and natural history, and they argued about things with the furious, engaged passion of children who were finally being taken seriously as thinkers. And the house, by slow degrees, began to come alive. She did not notice it happening at first. The way the curtains got replaced when Thomas tore the old ones trying to catch a moth, and Etta put up new ones in a blue that she happened to have in her bag, bought years ago for a project she had never finished. The way the kitchen began to smell like things that people actually wanted to eat, because she cooked the way her father had taught her, with whatever was available and a total commitment to doing it well. The way the bookshelves in the parlor began to have new things on them as she unpacked the 24 books she had brought in her carpetbag and arranged them alongside the ones already there. The way Caleb started laughing again, which was the kind of thing that changed the acoustic quality of a house in a way that was impossible to ignore. She noticed one morning that the quilt was off the back of the chair. She asked no one about it, and a week later it was on the boy's bed, where she suspected it had always belonged, and she thought that was a good sign without letting herself think too carefully about what it was a sign of. The rupture, when it came from outside. It was the morning of her 18th day at the ranch when a man arrived from town on a bay horse and handed Micah a letter that made his face go flat and still in the way a river goes still before a storm churns it up. He read it twice and put it in his shirt pocket next to the other one she had seen, and he thanked the man and went back to the barn and did not come to breakfast. She brought him coffee. She had told herself she would not, because it was not the kind of thing that respected the boundary she was supposed to be maintaining. But she brought him coffee anyway and stood in the barn door, and he was not working, which was how she knew the letter was serious. "Is it something that concerns the boys?" she asked, because that was the only question she had any right to ask. He looked at her. He held the coffee cup with both hands. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "My brother." She waited. "My brother has written to tell me he thinks I'm neglecting the boys and that I ought to send them to live with him and his wife in Kansas City until I've got a better arrangement here." He said it with controlled quietness, but the quietness had edges. "He wrote the same thing 6 months ago. I told him it was none of his concern. Now apparently it's his concern again." Etta thought about Caleb's laughter filling the kitchen that morning. She thought about Thomas explaining with complete authority the working principle of a steam engine to Rufus the hired hand while Rufus nodded along with what appeared to be genuine interest. She thought about the way Micah's hand rested on Caleb's head in the barn. "Those boys are not neglected," she said. The sharpness in her own voice surprised her. He looked at her again. "I know that," he said, "but my brother writes letters to lawyers." She understood then. The lawyer's office on Caldwell's Main Street. The kind of trouble that could arrive on paper before it arrived in person and do just as much damage. "What will you do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. He drank the coffee. "Thank you for this." She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen and thought about it, and came to a decision that she then spent the rest of the morning trying to talk herself out of. She could not talk herself out of it. After lunch, when the boys were occupied with their lessons at the kitchen table, and she had a legitimate reason to walk to where Micah was working on the fence at the south end of the property, she went and stood on the other side of the fence from him and said, "I have a suggestion." He straightened and looked at her. He had a post hole in progress, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and there was sweat along his jaw from the afternoon heat. "I think your brother's concern, whatever its motivation, is partly rooted in the fact that this household is irregular. That you're a widower with 2 young children and the only women who come and go are hired help who don't stay." She kept her voice practical because that was the only way she could get through it. "If you had a wife, there would be nothing for a lawyer to find argument in. The boys would have a woman in the household in a permanent and respectable way, and there would be nothing irregular about any of it." He stared at her. "I'm not suggesting it from sentiment," she said quickly. "I'm suggesting it as a solution to a practical problem. I have no place to go from here that is better than here. You need the problem with your brother solved. The boys need stability. It would be a practical arrangement." She ran out of words then and stood there in the afternoon light feeling extremely exposed. Micah looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read. Then he said, "I'll think on it," and turned back to the fence post. She had gone to the creek. She had sat on a flat rock and listened to the water, and turned the thing over and over in her hands, and tried to decide if she was being practical, or if she was being something else entirely, something more dangerous, something she had told herself at least a dozen times over the past 18 days that she was absolutely not being. The truth was that the boys were not the only reason she had made the suggestion. The truth was that she had watched Micah Hale for 18 days and had seen something in him that she could not stop thinking about. Something that had nothing to do with practical arrangements and everything to do with the quiet way he sat on the porch in the evenings, and the careful way he held his grief, and the look on his face in the barn when he thought no one was watching him. and she was 27 years old, and she had never felt anything quite like this. And it terrified her enough that she had dressed it up in practical language so she could say it out loud. She had sat by the creek for an hour. And then she had come back to the house, because whatever she decided, she needed to start dinner, and she had walked into the dining room and found the plate. She stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. Caleb was looking at her with his whole heart showing. Thomas was looking at the table as if he were thinking very hard about the principle of leverage. Micah was lifting the lid of the stew pot and serving himself without looking at her at all, which was itself a kind of answer. A man who could have pretended not to notice his sons had set a fourth place at the table and had simply decided not to pretend. Etta Merritt took a breath that went all the way down. She walked to the table and sat down in the fourth chair. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb exhaled so loudly that Thomas rolled his eyes, and Micah ladled stew into her bowl without being asked, and she picked up her spoon, and dinner proceeded as if the entire weight of the question had simply been absorbed by the act of sitting down. She did not decide anything that night. She told herself that sitting at the table was not a decision, it was just dinner. She went to her room after the dishes were done, and listened to the sounds of the house settling and the wind in the grass, and the boys arguing in hushed tones about something in the next room. And she lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and admitted to herself, finally, without any practical language dressed over it, that she did not want to leave this place. The following morning Micah knocked on the door of the kitchen where she was measuring out flour and waited until she turned to look at him before he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about a practical arrangement." "And," she said. He was holding his hat in his hands again, and the morning light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the gray in his hair and turned it silver, and he looked like a man who had made a decision that cost him something and was now going to see it through. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that if you agreed to this arrangement it would not have to be only practical. I'm not asking you to," he started again. "I'm not the man I was before Margaret died. I know that. I've been told that by enough people that I've accepted it. But I don't think I'm entirely past." He stopped again, and she could see that this was genuinely difficult for him, that he was a man who had spent 2 years building walls and was now standing on top of one trying to say something true from an uncomfortable height. "I think this house is better than it was 3 weeks ago," he said finally. "I think the boys are better, and I don't believe that's entirely about housekeeping." She looked at him. "If you agreed to stay," he said, "I would want it to be because you chose to, not because you had nowhere else to go." "I told you," she said, "I'm not easily discouraged." "That's not an answer," he said. She set down the measuring cup. She said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and she could see him register it. "Your sons put a plate at the table for me last night. You said nothing about it. I sat down. I think we both know what that means." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I suppose we do." "I'll need you to be honest with me," she said. "About the hard things. I don't need protecting from the truth." "I'll try," he said. "That's the most honest thing I can tell you." "Then yes," she said. "I choose to stay." He stood very still for a moment, as if he had to let the words settle before he could move. Then he nodded once, with the gravity of a man signing a treaty, and put his hat on and went to work. She turned back to her flour and stood there for a moment with a smile she allowed herself exactly because no one was watching. She was wrong about that. Thomas was watching from the hallway with calculating eyes, and when she looked up he was gone, and she heard him, a moment later, announcing something to Caleb in the yard in the urgent whisper of a boy who has just witnessed an event of major historical significance. The next question was the practical matter of how it was to be done. This was 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, and there were proprieties to observe. And Micah was a man who was known in the community and whose household was currently under the scrutiny of a brother who wrote to lawyers. A proper marriage was the only appropriate arrangement, and they both knew it. He rode to town the next day, and came back with the information that Reverend Calloway at the Methodist Church could marry them on the following Saturday if they came in the afternoon. He delivered this information at dinner with characteristic brevity, and the boys received it with very different expressions. Caleb openly triumphant and Thomas working extremely hard to appear casual. The week between the decision and the marriage was one of the strangest and most charged periods of Etta's life. They were not yet married, and they were also undeniably, irreversibly altered in their relationship to each other. Micah began saying good morning when he came to breakfast, which he had not previously done with any consistency. She found a bouquet of late wildflowers on the kitchen table one morning with no note, and she put them in the only glass jar she could find and set them in the center of the table, and neither of them said a word about it. He began staying in the parlor in the evenings after the boys went to bed, sitting in the chair across from where she usually sat to mend or read, not always talking, sometimes just there, and the companionable silence that developed between them was the kind that usually takes years to build and had apparently decided to happen fast. He told her about Margaret on Thursday evening. She had not asked. He simply began talking, quietly and steadily, sitting with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and she set down her mending and listened. Margaret had been from a family in Missouri. She had been funny, he said, in a dry, quick way, and she had been impatient and creative and deeply devoted to the boys. She had gotten sick in the spring of 1880 with a fever that the doctor had not been able to name properly or treat effectively, and she had been gone in 10 days, and the world had simply rearranged itself around an absence that he had never fully known how to address. "I don't want you to feel like you're replacing her," he said, "because you're not. He looked at her with that careful, precise attention. "You're entirely different, and I mean that as a statement of fact, not a comparison." "I understood you," she said. "Good," he said. He was quiet a moment. "She would have liked you, I think. She didn't have patience for timid people." "I'll take that as a compliment," Etta said. Something genuinely warm moved across his face then, not the place where a smile had been, but an actual smile, brief and real, and she felt it like stepping out of shade into sunlight and had to concentrate very carefully on her mending for the next several minutes. She told him about herself on Friday. Not all of it at once, but the substantial things. Her father and the print shop and the years of managing things alone and the school that closed. She told him about the apartment in St. Louis she had sublet to afford the train ticket, and the way she had sat on the train for 3 days watching the country change outside the window and felt, beneath the anxiety of the uncertain situation she was traveling toward, a kind of wild and defiant hope that she had not felt since she was a girl. She told him about Gerald Crane and the boarding house position that had dissolved on arrival, and he listened with focused attention and a tightening around his jaw at the Gerald Crane part that she appreciated. "You could have gone back," he said. "When the job fell through, you could have wired someone in St. Louis." "I could have," she said. "I didn't want to." He looked at her. "What did you want?" She thought about it honestly. "Something that felt like mine," she said. "Something I built instead of something I was assigned to." The look that crossed his face then was complicated and layered, and she could see him processing what she had said against something in his own experience, and then he nodded slowly as if something had been confirmed. "That I understand," he said. Saturday came with clear blue September sky and a sharp edge of autumn in the air. She wore the best dress she had brought with her, a deep blue wool that her friend Clara in St. Louis had told her was her most becoming color. Mrs. Abernathy insisted on pressing it for her, and sending over a small brooch that had been her own mother's, a spray of silver leaves, and the gesture was so unexpectedly kind that Etta had to spend a moment in the back room of the Abernathy store composing herself. Micah was waiting in front of the church in a suit that he wore with the slight self-consciousness of a man more comfortable in work clothes, which was the right kind of self-consciousness as far as she was concerned. He had Caleb and Thomas on either side of him. Caleb had clearly been attempting to comb his hair with thoroughness and had mostly succeeded. Thomas had his hands in his pockets and was watching Etta approach with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his version of deeply moved, which on Thomas looked like intellectual concentration, but carried entirely different contents. Reverend Calloway married them in front of a small gathering that included Mrs. Abernathy and her husband, Dietz and Rufus from the ranch, and a few other townspeople who had heard and come along because it was a social occasion, and Caldwell was not overrun with social occasions. The ceremony was brief and sincere. When Reverend Calloway asked Micah to say his vows, Micah looked at Etta with those gray-green eyes and said the words plainly and without fumbling, in the voice she had heard him use in the barn, the unarmored one, and she said hers back to him with equal steadiness, and felt the world shift under her feet in the way she imagined it was supposed to. He did not kiss her in the church the way some men did, making a performance of it. He just took her hand when the Reverend finished speaking and held it, and they walked out of the church together into the September afternoon with the boys behind them and the whole flat prairie sky above them, and he squeezed her hand once before he let it go to shake the Reverend's hand, and that squeeze said more than most speeches. The days that followed were a new kind of navigation. They were married, but they had known each other less than 3 weeks, and the facts of their new life together required a kind of gradual settling that could not be rushed by ceremony. She moved her things into the larger room. The house reorganized itself around the new configuration with the organic logic of all living things finding their arrangement. The boys did not change their behavior substantially, because in many important ways nothing had changed for them. Etta was still there making breakfast and teaching them star names and reading Jules Verne. Only now she was there with the additional permanence of title, and the fact that no one would ever again set a fourth plate as a question mark. The letter from Micah's brother arrived the following Tuesday. It was clearly written before the brother knew of the marriage, and it was unpleasant in its assumption of authority and its implication that Micah was failing his children in some fundamental way. She read it at the kitchen table because he handed it to her without preamble after reading it himself, and she read it twice and set it down. "Your brother," she said carefully, "is operating from incomplete information." "My brother," Micah said with restrained precision, "has been trying to run my life since our father died when I was 22. He's 8 years older than me, and he has never fully accepted that I am no longer 22. He looked at her. He's not a bad man. He's a controlling one, which is not the same thing but is occasionally just as much trouble. We should write to him," she said, "not defensively, just the facts, that you've married, that the household is in good order, that the boys are well. Facts leave less room for argument than emotion." Micah looked at her with something that was becoming a familiar expression, the look of a man being confirmed in a choice he had made. "I'll leave the writing to you," he said. "You do it better." She wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, and she wrote it with the precision and clarity of a woman who had spent 4 years communicating difficult things to parents and administrators, and had learned that the most effective words were always the plainest ones. She stated the facts of the marriage, the date, the Reverend's name. She described the household briefly and accurately. She mentioned the boys' studies and their general health. She did not apologize for anything or explain anything that did not require explanation. She signed it from both of them and blotted it and handed it to Micah, and he read it and then looked at her. "You've done this before," he said. "I've written a few letters in my time," she said. "Not that kind of letter," he said. "That kind of letter where you say everything necessary and nothing extra and each word is doing exactly the job it needs to do." She felt the back of her neck warm slightly. "My father was a printer," she said. "He had opinions about words." "He taught you well," Micah said, and the simplicity of it hit her more directly than a more elaborate compliment would have. He mailed the letter on Wednesday, and they received no response for 2 weeks. And in the silence of those 2 weeks, the house continued its quiet transformation. October arrived, and with it the first real cold and the deep blue evenings that Etta had already started to love. the particular quality of light that came at the end of a Kansas October day, when the sky went from orange to violet to a dark that was full of stars. She began the habit that would last for years of taking her coffee out to the porch after the boys were in bed, and Micah began the habit of bringing his own coffee out and sitting in the other chair, and they talked in the evenings with the increasing ease of two people who are discovering that they speak the same language, not always the same dialect, but the same fundamental language. He told her about the ranch's history. He had come out from Missouri himself at 23 with nothing but money borrowed from his older brother, which was the source of some of the complicated dynamic there, and the knowledge of cattle that he had accumulated working for a ranching outfit in Oklahoma Territory for 3 years before that. He had spent 5 years building the Hale Ranch from a dugout claim into what it was now, 300 acres of good grassland, and a head count that let him send 200 steers a year up the trail to Dodge City or Abilene. He was not wealthy by the standards of the great Texas ranches, but he was solvent and stable, and everything he had was genuinely his, which he said with a quiet pride that she completely understood. She asked him about the letter he had been reading when she first arrived, the one he had folded and put in his shirt pocket. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said it was a letter from Margaret's mother, his former mother-in-law in Missouri, who wrote to him twice a year. He still wrote back. He said it seemed right, that she was the boy's grandmother and she had lost her daughter, and he was not going to compound that by cutting off contact. She looked at him in the dark evening and thought, there it is again, the thing underneath the walls. You're a good man, Micah Hale, she said, not as flattery but as pure observation. He was quiet for a moment. I'm trying to be one again, he said, which was the most honest thing she had heard from him yet. The letter from his brother came back eventually. It was substantially shorter than the previous ones. It acknowledged the marriage in a tone that was not warm but was not hostile, and it expressed in carefully chosen words the hope that the boys were doing well. There was a postscript in a different hand, which turned out to be from his brother's wife, a woman named Helen, who said she hoped she and Etta might correspond, and that she had always thought her husband worried too much, which Etta took as a genuine olive branch and replied to accordingly. The matter of the brother resolved itself not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the gradual process of correspondence through which two families negotiate the terms of their coexistence, and by November it had settled into something manageable. October gave way to November, and November was when things between Micah and Etta shifted again. It was not a single event. It was the accumulation of evenings on the porch and mornings in the kitchen, and the shared daily work of a life held in common. It was the night Caleb got sick with a winter cold, and she sat up with him for 3 hours, and Micah appeared in the doorway at 2 in the morning, and they traded off without discussion, each of them going for a few hours and coming back, working with the efficient, wordless coordination of people who have somehow already learned to trust each other. It was the afternoon she was trying to move the heavy kitchen table to clean under it, and he appeared beside her and took the other end without being asked, and they moved it together, and then stood on either side of it in the rearranged kitchen, and looked at each other, and both of them started laughing at something that wasn't quite a joke but felt like it, and the laughter was new and warm and changed the temperature of the room. It was the evening she tried to fix the gate on the chicken coop and hit her thumb with the hammer and said something extremely unladylike, and he was behind her, and he took the hammer out of her hand with great gentleness and fixed the gate himself in 3 minutes and said nothing whatsoever about the thing she had said, and she loved him for that with a clarity that no longer surprised her. She had stopped arguing with herself about whether she loved him. The argument had become too exhausting and too obviously pointless. She loved him. She had loved him, she suspected, since the morning in the barn, or possibly earlier, possibly since the moment he stood at the fence and folded a letter carefully and tucked it against his heart. She was less certain what he felt. She knew there was something, The evenings on the porch were not the evenings of a man simply tolerating a new domestic arrangement. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching had a quality she recognized, something searching and warm that went past respect and practical gratitude into territory that was more complicated and more important. But he had told her himself that he was not the man he used to be. He had walls built like a military fort, Mrs. Abernathy had said, and she did not want to push through a wall that was not ready to come down, because she understood that the walls were not built against her specifically but against loss in general, and loss was a legitimate thing to build against. So she waited. She kept her own counsel. She was patient, which was not her natural inclination but which she had learned and was applying with considerable effort. It was Thomas who precipitated things, in the end. Thomas, who was 9 years old and had the instincts of a chess player, announced at dinner on the 5th of November that he thought his father was in love with Etta. He said it the way he said everything important, as if it were a conclusion he had reached after careful analysis and was now reporting for the record. He was eating a biscuit, and he said it between one bite and the next, looking at neither of his parents but at the middle distance, and the dinner table went absolutely silent. Caleb made a small sound. Etta looked at her plate. Micah looked at Thomas with an expression that was impossible to interpret. Thomas took another bite of his biscuit and said, "It's not a secret. It's just not a thing anybody's said out loud yet. I thought it would be more efficient to say it." "Thomas," Micah said, in a controlled tone. "I observed multiple indicators," Thomas said. "I can list them if that would be helpful." "It would not," Micah said. "Caleb has already said he thinks the same thing," Thomas added. "He just didn't want to be the one to say it because he cries at things." "Thomas," Caleb said with great dignity, "I do not—" "You cried at the ending of the Jules Verne book," Thomas said. "That is a completely separate matter," Caleb said. Etta had begun to laugh. She could not help it. It came up out of her before she could stop it, a real laugh, and she pressed her hand over her mouth because it was not a good moment for laughing and it came out anyway. And then Caleb laughed because she was laughing. And then Thomas permitted himself a small, satisfied smile that was, in its way, the most expressive thing she had ever seen on his face. Micah was looking at her. She looked back at him. She had her hand over her mouth and her eyes were bright, and she felt entirely transparent. And he was looking at her with the walls entirely down for the first time. And what was underneath them was exactly what she had suspected. "Boys," he said, still looking at her, "finish your dinner and get yourselves to bed." But Caleb started. "Now," Micah said, gently but absolutely. They finished their dinner in about 2 minutes flat, which was a record, and they went to their room with the particular haste of children who want to give adults privacy and also desperately want to listen at the door. And then it was just the two of them at the table with the lamp burning between them. Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My son is alarmingly perceptive." "He takes after his father," Etta said. He looked at her. She looked back. The fire in the stove made a soft sound. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a low, persistent whisper. "I think," he said carefully, "that I owe you the truth of something." She waited. "When I put that notice in the window at Abernathy's store," he said, "I was looking for someone to run the household. That's what I told myself, and I meant it. And when you arrived and Ruth Abernathy's name was enough to make me trust you from the first 5 minutes, I told myself that was just good judgment." He paused. "When you brought me coffee in the barn, and then again in the morning, I told myself that was just a person who paid attention to details. When the house started smelling like something I'd forgotten it could smell like, I told myself that was just competent housekeeping." She was very still. "I have been telling myself things about you," he said, "since approximately your 3rd day here, and Thomas is right, which I will not tell him because he does not need the encouragement. I have been so careful because—" He stopped and looked at the table. "I was not careful enough before. I let the whole weight of myself lean on one person and then she was gone and the falling was very bad. I did not want to fall like that again." "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm not sure you do yet," he said. because I'm trying to tell you that the carefulism has failed." He said it with a kind of rueful self-awareness that undid her entirely. "It has failed completely. It started failing around day 5, and it has been failing faster ever since. And Thomas pointing it out at the dinner table is apparently the universe telling me to stop pretending I have any ground left to stand on." She looked at him across the lamplight. "I am not Margaret," she said. It was important to say it clearly, because she had heard him say it first, and she needed him to know she had taken it seriously. "And you are not leaning the whole weight of yourself on me because you've been managing everything for 2 years and you're more capable than you give yourself credit for. What I think," she said, "is that you're not falling. I think you're standing up, and there's a difference." He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. He held it with the same steady intentionality he brought to everything completely, as if it mattered. She turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that for a while with the fire burning and the wind outside and the quiet sounds of the house around them, and it was the best conversation they had had yet, the one conducted entirely without words. After a while he said, "I want this to be real, not practical." "Micah," she said, "it stopped being practical about 2 weeks ago, possibly earlier." "The creek," he said. She looked at him. "You went to the creek to think," he said. "And I stood in the yard for an hour pretending to look at fences, and when you came back and sat down I was—" he paused. "I was relieved in a way that was significantly disproportionate to the practical situation." "You could have said something," she said. "So could you," he said, and he was entirely right, and she conceded the point with a small tilt of her head, and he smiled again, the real smile, and it was better every time she saw it. He walked her to the door of their room that night the way he had every night since the wedding, except that this time he did not stop at the door. He held her hand in the lamplight and looked at her face with the focused attention that she had come to understand was simply how he loved, with his whole careful self, and then he leaned forward and kissed her with the same quality of completeness. It was a beginning. December came and brought the first real snow and the early dark that settled over the prairie like a second silence, and the house that had been austere and lonely when Etta first arrived was now something entirely different. There were books on the shelves that got moved and read and argued about. There were drawings pinned to the wall that Thomas made with meticulous technical precision and Caleb made with enthusiastic chaos. There were star charts taped to the ceiling of the boys' room. There were flowers dried and hanging in the kitchen from the autumn that was over. Christmas that year was the first real one the boys had had since their mother died, or so Caleb told her with his characteristic transparency, noting that his father had made efforts the previous 2 years, but his heart had not been in it, and they had all 3 of them known it. Etta spent the weeks before Christmas in a sustained campaign of decoration and preparation that she threw herself into partly for the boys and partly for Micah, who watched the house become festive with an expression that was trying to stay neutral and consistently failing. She made paper chains with the boys. She put pine branches along the mantelpiece and tied them with red ribbon from the dry goods shipment she had ordered from the Abernathy store in October, planning ahead with the thoroughness of a woman who had been managing households since 16. She made a pudding that her father had always made at Christmas and taught Caleb the recipe so he would always have it. She wrote to Margaret's mother in Missouri and received back a warm letter that included a small carved wooden horse that Margaret's father had made, which she gave to Caleb with Margaret's mother's words attached. And Caleb held it very carefully and said thank you in a voice that was entirely Thomas-like in its controlled precision, and she could see him deciding not to cry and respecting the decision. Micah gave her a book for Christmas, a genuine and carefully chosen book, a collected volume of natural history essays that he had clearly had ordered from somewhere because Caldwell did not stock such things, which meant he had thought about what she would want weeks before and made deliberate arrangements. The inside cover had her name written in his precise, direct handwriting, Etta Hale, and the date, and she stood in the parlor holding it and felt the warmth of it go through her like the first day of spring. She gave him a piece she had written herself, a history of the ranch from what she had gathered from his own stories, and from the evidence of the land itself, written in the same clear, direct style she brought to everything, with notes about the property and the years and the changes. And at the end of it she had written a paragraph that was not history but was something else. And he read it twice and looked at her with the full and unguarded attention she loved in him, and did not need to say anything, and didn't. January was the month she told him she suspected she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before the boys were up, because it was not a conversation that needed an audience. She had known for a few weeks, and had spent those weeks in an internal debate that ended only when she decided that secrecy was inconsistent with the kind of marriage she was trying to build, and so she told him. He was completely still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not in the place where a smile had been, or the real smile, or the complicated, careful grief look, but something rawer and brighter than any of those. And he crossed the kitchen and pulled her toward him with an embrace that said everything that the moment required. "Good," he said, which was not a grand or eloquent declaration, but was, from Micah, the most comprehensive possible response, and she laughed against his shoulder. She wrote to Mrs. Abernathy that day, and received back a letter that contained so many exclamation marks that it was impossible to read without smiling, and also a list of practical preparations and a firm instruction to rest, which Etta filed away under good intentions, and then mostly ignored because there was too much to do. She wrote to Clara in St. Louis, and she wrote to her own mother's sister in Ohio, her only remaining family, who wrote back a trembling and genuinely delighted letter that arrived in February and made her cry in the good way over breakfast, which alarmed Caleb until she explained what it said. The pregnancy reshaped the spring in increments. She was not given to complaint or dramatics about physical discomfort, which meant that the main adjustment was practical, and Micah and the boys adapted with impressive efficiency. Caleb decided he was responsible for the morning water fetching without being asked, which she discovered when she came to the kitchen one morning and found both buckets full. Thomas began making coffee, which he approached as an engineering problem and eventually solved to everyone's satisfaction. Micah reorganized his own schedule to be closer to the house in the afternoons, without saying a word about it or pretending he was doing anything other than what was obvious. She caught him once reading a medical text he had ordered, sitting at the kitchen table late in the evening after she had gone to bed, and she stood in the hallway and watched him for a moment before going back to their room, and the tenderness she felt was so large it had no edges. Spring in Kansas is a complicated season, beautiful and violent by turns, with storms that come up fast and light that comes back after a long winter like something personally recovered. The grass turned green again in March, and the prairie came back to life in the way it always does, insistently and without asking permission. And by April the Hale Ranch looked like something painted by a person who was in love with the specific quality of light on that flat, open land. The thing with Gerald Crane, which she had put entirely out of her mind since the autumn, came back in April in a form she had not anticipated. She had gone to Caldwell for supplies and ran into him on the main street, and he was much diminished from the dismissive authority he had displayed at their first meeting, having apparently had a run of bad luck with the boarding house he had inherited, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been wrong about something and was not enjoying knowing it. She could have been ungracious. She was not. She was polite and brief and went about her business, and on the way home she thought about all the things that would not have happened if she had turned around and gone back to St. Louis when the position dissolved, and felt a gratitude so large it required the whole sky to contain it. The summer was full and warm and busy with the work of the ranch and the work of preparing for a new child, and Etta found herself in the peculiar and pleasant position of being genuinely happy, which was something she had worked toward for a long time and had not always been certain she would reach. The boys thrived. Caleb, at 11 going on 12, was entering the period where he was starting to take a real interest in the ranch work, following Micah around in the evenings with questions that Micah answered with the patient attention he brought to all forms of teaching when he was not aware he was doing it. Thomas finished every book in the house, and Etta began ordering more from a bookseller in Kansas City, who had been recommended by Helen, Micah's sister-in-law, with whom she had developed a genuine correspondence over the months, and who had turned out to be an intelligent and warm-hearted woman who found her husband's tendency toward intervention as exhausting as everyone else did. Micah's brother, whose name was Robert, came to visit in July. She had been slightly nervous about it, though she would not have said so. Robert arrived on a Thursday with his wife Helen, who was exactly as her letters had suggested, and the visit was nothing like the confrontation she had prepared herself for, which was a lesson in the difference between the versions of people we construct from second-hand information and the actual individuals they turn out to be. Robert was 8 years older than Micah and had the same jaw and the same careful eyes, and he was controlling in the way of men who have spent their lives being responsible for things and have not fully learned to distinguish between responsibility and authority. He looked at the ranch house with its books and its blue curtains and its dried flowers and its pinned drawings and its well-fed, clearly thriving children, and something in his expression went through a significant readjustment. He and Etta had a conversation on the second day of the visit, sitting on the porch in the evening with lemonade, while Micah and Helen and the boys were in the barn looking at the new foal that Rufus's mare had produced the previous week. Robert said, with the careful phrasing of a man who is not accustomed to making concessions, that he could see the household was in good order and that he appreciated that the boys were clearly doing well. He said it looking out over the grassland rather than at her, which she understood was not evasion, but just the way he processed things that were difficult for him to say. "He's my brother," Robert said. "After Margaret died, I was worried about him." "Not just the boys, him." "I know," she said. "That was the right thing to worry about." "He seems better," Robert said, in the tone of someone making an admission they had not prepared for. "He is better," she said. "He's worked at it." Robert looked at her then directly, and she met his gaze without flinching. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Mrs. Abernathy told me that's a compliment coming from you," she said, which was not something Mrs. Abernathy had said but was the kind of thing she might say, and the corner of Robert's mouth moved in a way that was absolutely a family expression. By the end of the visit, the relationship had been established on something solid, not warm in the effortless way, but honest, which was better and more durable. Helen embraced her when they left and told her to write and promised to write back, and Robert shook Micah's hand and held it a moment longer than necessary, and said something quiet that she was not meant to hear and did not try to. And Micah looked at his brother with the complicated expression of a man who has been carrying an old weight and is considering setting it down. He was quiet that evening on the porch after the wagon had gone and the dust had settled back into the road. She did not push him. She sat beside him and watched the last light go out of the sky and let him think. Finally he said, "It's been a long time since Robert and I were." He paused. "We used to be close, before our father died, before everything became about money and property and who owned what." "It doesn't have to stay the way it's been," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." August came in with full heat and Etta with it in her 8th month, and not particularly interested in being slowed down by that fact, which produced a recurring negotiation with Micah that was less an argument than a perpetual balancing of her determination and his care. He did not tell her what to do. He was too intelligent for that and too respectful of who she was. He simply appeared beside things she was trying to do and offered to help with the part that required the most exertion, and she let him because she was sensible, not because she had been managed. The baby came on the 12th of August in the pre-dawn hours, with Mrs. Abernathy present because she had insisted on being sent for when the time came, and she had been entirely right to insist. It was a boy. He was born fast and strong and announced his arrival in a way that woke both Caleb and Thomas, and probably several surrounding acres of Kansas. They named him James, after Etta's father. Micah held him in the early morning light with the expression of a man who has been reminded of something essential, something he had nearly let grief make him forget. And she watched him from the bed with James's small fist wrapped around Micah's finger, and felt the rightness of everything so completely that it was almost overwhelming. Caleb, when he was allowed in, sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his brother with an expression of pure and undefended love that was the most purely Caleb thing he had ever done. Thomas stood in the doorway with his arms folded and examined the baby with clinical interest and then said, "He's got Papa's nose," which was both accurate and the highest compliment Thomas was equipped to offer, and which made Micah laugh, the real laugh, which woke James and started the cycle again. In the months that followed, the Hale Ranch settled into the particular rhythm of a household that has found its form. Etta returned to teaching the boys within 2 weeks of the birth because her mind required occupation, propping James against her arm, while she explained the water cycle to Caleb, or helped Thomas work through the mathematics of bridge engineering. Micah watched this and made no comment except to rearrange the schedule so that she had help with James during the morning teaching hours, which he accomplished by having Dietz and Rufus check in at the house rather than just the barn, and which she accepted without pointing out that it was exactly the kind of practical management he denied doing. She wrote to Clara in St. Louis, who sent a small silver spoon for James that had been their mutual friend Lucy's, a gesture of connection across distance that made the country feel less enormous. She wrote to Margaret's mother, who responded with deep warmth and asked for the smallest details of James and of Caleb and Thomas, and Etta wrote them down carefully because she understood that this woman had lost her daughter and that every piece of information about her grandsons was a form of staying connected to what had been taken from her. Fall came again. Exactly 1 year after Etta had arrived at the Hale Ranch on the borrowed Henderson wagon with her carpetbag and her $40. She thought about this on a morning in mid-September when she was standing at the kitchen window watching Micah in the yard with Caleb, showing him something about the saddle repair, and Thomas was at the table behind her doing mathematics with the quiet intensity he brought to things he found genuinely engaging. And James was asleep in the basket by the stove making the small sounds that sleeping babies make. And the house smelled like coffee and dried grass and the particular earthy sweet smell of early autumn Kansas. She had arrived with nothing that belonged here, and everything that turned out to belong here had been built in the year between. Micah came in for coffee mid-morning and found her still at the window and came to stand beside her close, the way he stood beside her now and looked out at whatever she was looking at. "Thinking," he said. "About this time last year," she said. He was quiet a moment. "You weren't sure about staying." "I was sure," she said. "I was just not ready to say it." "I know," he said. "So was I." She looked at him. He was looking at the yard with those gray-green eyes that still did the same thing to her chest that they had done from the beginning, and the morning light caught the silver at his temples and the weather in his face and the particular quality of his stillness that she had learned to read like a language. "Micah," she said, "I'm glad your sons put that plate on the table." He turned to look at her with the full attention he had given her from the first conversation, that precise and considered and genuine regard. "So am I," he said. He kissed her the way he did it when the boys were not watching, unhurried and complete, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of him and the life they were inside of. Thomas's voice came from the table. "I can hear that from here and I find it distracting from my mathematics." "Then go do your mathematics somewhere else," Micah said without turning around, and Thomas made a sound of profound philosophical suffering and picked up his slate and went to the parlor, and James made a small noise in the basket and went back to sleep, and outside Caleb was singing something to the horses in the off-key, enthusiastic way he sang everything. The months rolled forward in the way that months do when life is what it should be, neither too fast nor too slow, each day with its own weight and color, and the particular texture of seasons on the Kansas plain. James took his first steps on a February morning when the snow was thick against the windows, and everyone was in the house. And Caleb grabbed Thomas's arm and Thomas allowed it without complaint, which was a measure of how important the moment was. Micah set him down after catching him and got back down on the floor, and held out his hands, and James stood for a moment with the concentrated gravity of someone doing something of enormous importance, and then walked directly into his father's hands, as if this had always been the only destination. In the spring, Etta began teaching not just Caleb and Thomas, but several other children from nearby homesteads, because word had spread, the way word spreads in rural communities, by the particular invisible telegraph of people talking across fence lines and at the general store and after church. There were 5 children at first, and then 8, and then 11, and Micah built a proper addition to the back of the ranch house that became a schoolroom with real benches and a good blackboard he ordered from Kansas City. And by the following spring, Caldwell had formally recognized it as a school, and Etta had a salary from the county for the first time in 3 years, which she received with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has built something from nothing and has the papers to prove it. Helen and Robert came for a second visit that summer, and it was considerably warmer than the first, because time and correspondence and the arrival of James had done the work that direct conversation had not quite managed. Robert carried James around the yard with the careful pride of a man who has discovered something he was not prepared to love as much as he did. Helen sat with Etta on the porch and talked for hours in the way that women talk when they have found someone worth talking to, about books and children and the nature of the men they had each married, and the particular challenges of building a life on a frontier where the logistics were hard and the distances between people were great, and the rewards were real but required patience to arrive at. 2 years after the plate had been set at the table, Caleb turned 13, and Thomas turned 11, and James turned 1, and the Hale Ranch had a horse breeding operation beginning alongside the cattle, because Thomas had become entirely absorbed in the mechanics of it after a conversation with Dietz, who had spent time in Kentucky and knew something about bloodlines. And Micah had listened to Thomas explain the financial case for diversification with the same expression he wore when Thomas was 9, and announced his father's feelings at the dinner table. The expression of a man being reminded that the people around him are more than he has given them credit for. 3 years after that night at the dinner table, Etta told Micah she was expecting again. This time in the morning before the boys were up again, but with the ease of a woman who has told this man things before and known them received well. He pulled her close in the kitchen with the coffee going and the early light coming through the window, and held her there with the same completeness he had the first time. "Another James," he said. "Or not," she said. "We could have a girl." "Caleb will adore her," Micah said. "Thomas will insist she take a measurable aptitude test." She laughed against his shoulder. "That sounds exactly right." It was, in fact, a girl. She arrived in the autumn, the 2nd of October, in a room that smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke, attended by Mrs. Abernathy, who had been attending births in Caldwell for 15 years and showed no signs of slowing down. She was small and fierce, and had her father's gray-green eyes and Etta's stubborn jaw, and Caleb named her Clara before anyone else could suggest anything. After a photograph, he had once seen of a woman called Clara who seemed to him like a name that suited a person of consequence. The photograph was from Etta's letter collection. Clara was Etta's friend in St. Louis, who had told her years ago that the blue wool dress was her most becoming color, and had sent a silver spoon for James. When Etta told her, in the letter written 3 weeks after the birth, that the newest member of the Hale family bore her name, the response she received was so overflowing with emotion that several words were almost illegible, and she read it to Micah in the evening on the porch, and they were both smiling by the end of it. The years laid themselves down on the Hale Ranch like good layers, each one adding something to what was already there without displacing it. Caleb grew into a young man of 16, 17, 18, who had his father's seriousness and his mother's directness, meaning Etta's directness, because he had come to call her mama somewhere around the second year without announcement or ceremony, as naturally as breathing, and Thomas had followed a month later with the particular Thomas quality of acting, as if he had made a considered decision rather than felt a feeling. Both boys had taken easily and completely to James, and then to Clara, and the age gap between them made them more like additional parents than siblings in the way that ranch life sometimes arranged families, everyone called to contribute and calibrated by the work. Dietz and Rufus, the two hands who had been with the ranch since before Etta arrived, became in their way part of the extended family of the place, taking their Sunday dinners at the main house and being fixtures at every celebration. Dietz turned out to have a gift for teaching riding that served both James, who was fearless and needed managing, and Clara, who was methodical about it in a way that made Thomas very proud. The school in the back of the ranch house became, by 1888, a proper schoolhouse in the town of Caldwell, moved to a building on the main street that the town council voted to fund in a meeting that Etta attended, and at which she argued her case with the same precision and lack of excess that had characterized everything she had ever done in writing or in speech. She kept teaching it. She hired 2 other teachers as the enrollment grew. She ran the school with the same quality of organized competence she brought to the household, and the household never suffered for it because she had, by that point, the full partnership of Micah, who had long since stopped being a man who did not help with domestic things and had become simply a man who did what needed doing, which was, she had always believed, the only kind of man worth having. The ranch prospered. Not extravagantly, not in the way of the great cattle empires that were already beginning to feel the pressure of changing markets and encroaching fences, but solidly and well, expanding with the horse breeding, and a small dairy operation that Etta proposed on the grounds that fresh milk and butter for the school children was a better use of the land than another 50 head of beef cattle, and the numbers supported it. Which Micah verified on paper over 2 evenings, and confirmed with the look of a man who knew when he had been right about something, and was specifically glad he had been right about marrying someone who could do this. Micah, in the evenings on the porch, read her something once from a letter he had been writing to Robert, something he had crossed out and then read to her anyway because she was beside him, and it seemed right to share it. He had written, "I spent 2 years building walls against everything good, and then a woman came in with a carpetbag and a schoolteacher's backbone, and the walls turned out to be less substantial than I thought. I cannot decide whether to be embarrassed about the walls or grateful for their failure." I have decided to be grateful. She had taken the paper from him and looked at it and then looked at him. "Are you embarrassed about the walls?" she asked. "A little," he said. "Don't be," she said. "They were built for the right reason. They just weren't needed anymore." He took the paper back and crossed out the sentence about embarrassment and kept the one about being grateful and sent it, and Robert wrote back something that was, for Robert, unexpectedly generous, which was its own small landmark in the long ongoing work of that relationship. Years accumulated. James grew from a toddler into a boy of 6, 7, 8, with his father's careful eyes and his mother's love of books and a personality entirely his own that was warmer and more socially gifted than either of them, and made him the kind of person everyone in any room was glad to have there. Clara developed from a fierce small baby into a fierce small girl who had opinions about everything, and expressed them with complete conviction, and who was, in this as in everything, exactly what a child of Etta and Micah Hale would logically produce. And the combination of Caleb's adoration and Thomas's earnest tutoring and both parents' genuine respect for her thinking made her the most comprehensively supported child in the county. which Etta occasionally worried about before remembering that support was not the same as coddling, and that what Clara was getting was the thing she had always wanted for herself. Caleb, at 20, rode the trail to Wichita for the first time as a full hand on the ranch's annual cattle drive, and came back sunburned and confident and told Etta, sitting on the porch steps in the evening of his return, that he had thought about her the whole way up the trail when things were uncertain, and it had helped, which was the kind of thing Caleb said because he meant it entirely. And she held the fact of it quietly and completely in the way. She held all the things that had happened since the afternoon she had ridden up the Chisholm road in a borrowed wagon, and found a man standing at a fence holding a letter against his heart. The evening of their 10th anniversary, Micah found her in the kitchen after the children were in bed, standing at the window she had stood at 1,000 times, and he came to stand beside her as he always did and looked at whatever she was looking at, which was the sky above the dark prairie going from copper to violet in the way that Kansas skies when in the autumn, and the stars beginning to show at the edge of it in the way that Caleb had first learned to name them years ago at this very table. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she said. He was quiet in the comfortable way he had been quiet beside her for 10 years now, the silence of a man who does not need to fill space with words because the space is already full of something better. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the morning after the plate?" "I said I wanted it to be real," he said, "not practical." "Yes," she said. And he said, she looked at him. He was 42 now, with more silver in his hair and the same gray-green eyes, and the same quality of full attention he had given her from the first day, and she felt the same thing in her chest she had felt in the barn doorway when she first understood what was underneath the walls, warm and large and without edges. "It is real," she said, "more real than anything I've ever been inside of." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked out at the prairie dark, and the stars coming up one by one the way Caleb had named them years ago, the way James was starting to name them now, the great turning wheel of the sky over the flat Kansas land that held everything they had built and everything they were still building, the ranch and the school and the family that had begun with a plate at a table, and a man who had said nothing about it because he had already, in the only way that mattered, said everything.